On the 15th of February 1942, the British surrendered the island of Singapore to the Japanese. 85,000 British, Australian, Indian and local troops were taken prisoner. It was the largest ever surrender in the history of the British Army and totally undermined the British Empire in Asia and the Pacific region. Many thousands of those prisoners would die in camps before the war finished, and those returning bore the physical and mental scars for the rest of their lives. So, seeing as the British outnumbered their Japanese attackers by 2-1, how did this disaster come about? And how much was the British commander, Lieutenant General Percival, responsible for this defeat? Prior to the Second World War, the British had seen her naval base at Singapore as the key to defending the empire in Asia and the Pacific in the face of the growing expansionist ambitions of the Japanese. Despite opening a £60 million naval base in 1938, due to financial pressures, they decided not to station a fleet at the colony, but instead rely on a main fleet to Singapore strategy. Should hostilities break out, the bulk of the Royal Navy would race from Europe through the Suez Canal and be at Singapore in 70 days. It was envisaged that Singapore would become a fortress, a Gibraltar of the Far East, capable of withstanding any naval attack. And whilst waiting for the main fleet to arrive, the Royal Air Force, whose airfields would be protected by the army, would defend the island. But there were flaws with this grandiose strategy. Firstly, the assumption was that any threat would come from the sea. Consequently, Singapore was defended by powerful gun batteries on the south and east coasts, looking out towards a naval enemy. No one seriously considered an attack from the Malay Peninsula. After all, that was covered in thick, impenetrable jungle that no army could get through. Nature could defend Singapore from the north. A second flaw was that if you were going to rely on the RAF to defend Singapore, then it needed the planes to do so. And throughout the 1920s and 30s, successive governments had cut the defence budget to the bone. Equally, the army that was then supposed to protect the air bases was never at the numbers needed to either protect the bases or counter a determined invasion of the Malayan Peninsula. And above all, the strategy's greatest flaw was that it presumed that the majority of the fleet could sail to Singapore. But what if the Royal Navy was needed elsewhere, like there was another major war in Europe, for instance? Then Singapore would be an empty naval base, a long way from help. And it wasn't as if nobody was spotting these critical flaws. Major General Sir William Dobbie was the general officer commanding the British Army in Malaya from 1935 to 1939. He decided to pressure test the prevailing Fortress Singapore theory. Together with his Chief of Staff, he decided to stand in the shoes of his enemy and plan an attack. And in Dobbie's mind, there was only one enemy: Japan. Accepting that any attack from the sea would be sunk by those sea-facing guns at Singapore, he looked at alternatives. And the obvious alternative in his mind was to attack from the landward side of the island. In other words, from the Malayan Peninsula. He actually identified 3 points, one on the northeast coast of Malaya and 2 a short distance across the border in Thailand, where amphibious landings could take place. He also proved that it was possible to land during the monsoon season of October through to March, something that previous planners had dismissed. And furthermore, he noted that the cloud cover provided by those monsoons would severely limit aerial reconnaissance and bombing of any such landings. Dobbie finally concluded that, contrary to popular opinion, the Malayan jungle was not impenetrable. An army could move through it. His Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Percival, penned a report outlining Dobbie's thoughts to the War Office and a request to significantly increase the garrison and to construct defensive lines on the peninsula. The report was ignored. When the Second World War broke out in Europe, Singapore seemed a long way away, and with the threat of invasion of Britain, the siege of Malta, and Rommel's advance through North Africa, Singapore moved down the list of priorities. But if the island was a low priority for the British, it was moving up the agenda in Tokyo. Fighting the costly war in China and with the USA threatening sanctions, The Japanese decided that the raw materials of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies could sustain her war effort in the face of that American economic pressure. And the key base to control both those territories was Singapore. So, whilst the British dithered and rested on their laurels, the Japanese prepared. Meanwhile, both the air and land defences of Singapore and Malaya were now the responsibility of Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke-Popham. The First World War RAF veteran was appointed Commander-in-Chief, British Far East Command in late 1940. Now in his early 60s and suffering from ill health, Brooke-Popham brought a distinct lack of energy to his role. Despite having less than 200 planes at his disposal, he dismissed the threat presented by the Japanese Air Force, claiming the Japanese were not built to be natural flyers, and they'd never fought a European Air Force before. When it was pointed out that his air defences included 24 antiquated Vickers Wildebeest torpedo bombers, and that his most modern planes were Brewster Buffaloes, which were dismissed for service in Europe, he replied, "We can get on all right with the Brewster Buffaloes out here. Let England have the Super Spitfires and the Hyper Hurricanes." To have London dismissing the Japanese threat so casually was bad enough. To have your local commander agreeing with them rather than fighting his corner was a recipe for disaster. And this general ignorance, overconfidence and racial prejudice was not limited to the Commander-in-Chief. Many in the military and colonial administration held a similar view. Basically, the Japanese might be okay fighting the Chinese, but they'd meet their match against the British and the Australians. And don't forget that prevailing view, despite General Dobbie's report, that the jungle was an added defence. And into this British hubris and complacency in April 1941 entered Lieutenant General Arthur Percival. Born in Hertfordshire in 1887, he'd been commissioned at the beginning of the First World War, where he was wounded at the Battle of the Somme and awarded both the Military Cross and the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO. After the war, he attended Staff College, where he came to the attention of Colonel John Dill, who would go on all the way to become a Field Marshal. With the up-and-coming Dill as his mentor, doors opened for Percival. Eventually, upon Dill's recommendation, he was appointed General Staff Officer, effectively Chief of Staff, to the General Officer commanding Malaya, General Dobbie, in 1936. And that report that he wrote on behalf of Dobbie, pointing out the vulnerability of Malaya, was just the sort of staff officer task that he really excelled at. As one contemporary Riley commented, he was excellent in any role that didn't involve contact with troops. And yet in April 1941, once again thanks to Dill, who was now Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Percival was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant General and posted to Malaya as the new General Officer Commanding, reporting in to Brooke-Popham. Having penned Dobbie's report a few years earlier, Percival was somewhat perturbed to find that the situation in Malaya and Singapore hadn't really improved. His command was woefully under strength. His troops were mainly inexperienced, and he possessed not a single tank. With his insights having worked for Dobbie, you might think that Percival would inject a sense of urgency into the command and rattle a few cages back in Whitehall. But that wasn't his way. As the resident minister in the area, Duff Cooper, said of Percival, "It was all a field day at Aldershot to him. He knows the rules and he follows them closely, and is waiting for the umpire's whistle to blow for the ceasefire." That tendency to play by the rules and not rock the boat was the opposite of what was needed when Singapore, still not a war zone, was at the very back of the queue for military resources, behind the home front, North Africa, and now even Stalin's Soviet Union. For instance, his requests for tanks were ignored by the War Office. Instead, on Winston Churchill's orders, 350 obsolete tanks were sent to Russia, rather than to Malaya. And whilst old, those tanks could have matched the light and medium tanks that the Japanese used in the forthcoming campaign. However, he was the man on the ground, and could maximise the resources that he did have. So imagine his chief engineer, Brigadier Ivan Simpson's surprise, when, concerned that Fortress Singapore was far from that, he presented a 5-point plan to bolster the defences to his boss, only for Percival to refuse to sanction any of them, and without any reason. A few months later, in August 1941, Simpson tried again. He requested permission to construct a series of defences in Johor, the Malayan state just across the water from Singapore, and directly in line of any enemy advance from the north. Percival once more refused, stating that it would be bad for morale, both troops and civilians, which is an interesting stance considering that the whole south and east of the island were bristling with guns. The one positive step that the British government did take in 1941 to bolster Singapore was to send the Royal Navy battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser HMS Repulse to act as a deterrent to any Japanese hostile intentions. But unfortunately, the aircraft carrier that was meant to accompany them, HMS Indomitable, ran aground and was now undergoing repairs in Virginia. And thus, Britain's naval response to the Japanese rising threat was a pale shadow of the main fleet to Singapore battle cry. HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse arrived at Singapore on the 30th of April 1941, and not a moment too soon. Unbeknown to the British, a Japanese invasion fleet set sail on the 4th of December. It was spotted by an Australian Lockheed Hudson scout plane from their airbase in Malaya on the 6th of December, heading west off the southern shores of Indochina. At this stage, it wasn't clear where the convoy was actually heading, but Malaya and the nearby beaches in Thailand were a distinct possibility. Since General Dobbie's day, the British had a plan for just such a situation. Operation Matador would see British troops crossing the Thai border to confront the Japanese on the beaches. However, that would violate Thai neutrality, so you had to be really sure that the invasion was taking place. And Brooke-Popham was not going to end his unblemished career gambling on unleashing British troops into a neutral country until he had more proof. That proof came the following day when an aerial reconnaissance confirmed that the Japanese were now fast approaching the very landing beaches that General Dobbie had predicted a few years ago. By now, Brooke-Popham had missed his opportunity. The Japanese were beyond the beaches long before his troops carrying out Matador could get there. In the early hours on the 8th of December 1941, 3 crack divisions from the Japanese 25th Army came ashore. The battle-hardened veterans from the war in China were commanded by General Tomoyuki Yamashita. The Japanese general had actually been offered 5 divisions, but decided to use just 3 to preserve his supplies. Percival, however, always believed he was up against 5 divisions, and that would influence his actions throughout the forthcoming campaign. Meanwhile, with the landings now in full flow, Brooke-Popham decided to cancel Matador in favour of a more limited advance, whose purpose was to move into Thailand and slow down the Japanese advance, to enable a defensive line to be constructed by the British Army at Jitra in northern Malaya. Crossing the border, they came under ferocious fire from the Thai police, before being checked by the advancing Japanese long before they were able to reach their limited objectives. The morale of his troops sank as they now retreated back through the monsoon rain towards the incomplete defences at Jitra. Now that it was clear where the landings were taking place, Admiral Tom Phillips on HMS Prince of Wales sailed with HMS Repulse and several destroyers towards the landing areas. Now, I've actually covered this naval battle in a recent episode, so without retelling that story, here is just a very quick summary. He sailed north only to be attacked by Japanese aircraft on the 10th of December. Using bombs and torpedoes, the Japanese sank both HMS Prince of Wales and the Repulse. It was a shattering blow to the British. Not only had the Japanese inflicted a significant naval defeat, but it left Singapore with no effective naval defence capability. As the Japanese now advanced into Malaya, they were supported by over 200 light and medium tanks. Percival, on the other hand, did not have a single tank in his army. And overhead, the Japanese Air Force outnumbered the RAF and the Royal New Zealand and Royal Australian Air Forces by at least 4-1. And those numbers, the quality of their planes, and the fact that Japanese pilots actually were built to fly, rapidly gave them air superiority through the campaign. On that same day that the 2 British warships were sunk, the Japanese reached the British defensive line at Jitra. The 14-mile line was being held by 2 brigades of the 11th Indian Division under Major General Murray Lyons. Despite its name, the 11th Indian included the 1st Leicestershires and the 2nd East Surreys from the British Army, along with 3 Punjab regiments, the Jats, and 3 battalions of Gurkhas. The ferocity of the Japanese attack led Percival to believe that they had committed a whole division. In reality, it was just 2 battalions. But nevertheless, the Japanese broke through the defensive line, and over the next 3 days, the Battle of Jitra turned into a rout. Throughout the rest of December, the Japanese advanced down the western side of the Malayan Peninsula, driving Percival's army before them. Using bicycles, the Japanese were able to move swiftly along any tracks available in the jungle. Whilst renowned for their banzai charges, their preferred tactic was to outflank the British and Indian defensive positions by advancing through the jungles, which of course the defenders had believed were impenetrable. Time and time again, as they faced encirclement, Percival's men were forced to conduct fighting retreats. When the British tried to hold a defensive line at the Slim River in early January, 2 Indian brigades were practically annihilated when the Japanese used tanks in a surprise night attack, with over 500 killed and 3,000 men captured. On the 10th of January, the British abandoned Kuala Lumpur, and the Japanese entered unopposed the following day. Back in London, Winston Churchill was beginning to think that Malaya would have to be abandoned, and that the British Army would need to retire onto the fortress of Singapore. And yet, despite the obvious danger of an attack from the Malayan mainland, Percival had still not ordered the construction of any defences on the north of Singapore Island. Instead, Percival now planned to fight a decisive battle in northwest Johor on the mainland. By now, Brooke-Popham had been removed, and Percival was reporting into a new commander. General Archibald Wavell, the Commander-in-Chief India, had been appointed to head up a new multinational command, the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, to take on the Japanese in Southeast Asia. Wavell agreed with the idea of a battle in northwest Johor in principle, but he too doubted Percival's abilities, saying that he has the knowledge but not the personality to carry through a tough fight. On the other hand, Wavell was more than impressed with the Australian general and Percival's subordinate, Gordon Bennett. Bennett's upbeat rhetoric, including his claim that 1 Australian is worth 10 Japanese, was music to Wavell's ears. Percival had planned his decisive action to be fought by the Indian Three Corps, whilst the Australians would maintain their defensive position to the east in case of further Japanese landings. Wavell, however, decided to override the GOC Malaya. He insisted that the Australians should be moved west for the forthcoming battle, and that Bennett should be the commander on the ground, rather than the commander of Three Corps, General Lewis Heath. Percival accepted his superior's intervention. On the 14th of January 1942, the Australians went into action. In a carefully prepared ambush on a bridge crossing the river near Gemas, the Australians inflicted 600 casualties on the advancing Japanese. The following day, however, things started to unravel for General Gordon Bennett. The Japanese launched an amphibious landing on the coast, which swiftly outflanked the 45th Indian Brigade, which Bennett had left there. Now very much on the back foot, Bennett's Australian and Indian troops had to break out of an encirclement. Only 500 out of 3,000 men made it to safety. Wavell now accepted the inevitable. The war in Malaya was lost. Percival needed to get all his men back onto Singapore Island. And yet still, there were no serious defences being constructed on the island. On the 19th of January, Churchill cabled General Wavell, stating that it was imperative that Percival hold out on Singapore. Not only was British honour at stake, but Churchill was concerned how a surrender would be interpreted by the Americans, seeing as their own troops were making a desperate last stand at Bataan in the Philippines. Now reinforcements started to arrive in Singapore. On the 22nd of January, 7,000 men of the 44th Indian Infantry Brigade landed, the bulk of whom were raw recruits. 2 days later, a further 1,900 Australians arrived. Again, they were only recent recruits with only the most basic of training. And then on the 29th of January, The British 18th Division, consisting of the Royal Norfolks, the Royal Suffolks, the Sherwood Foresters, the Beds and Herts, and the 1st Cambridgeshires, landed. They had originally been heading to North Africa, but as their ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope, it was suddenly diverted eastwards across the Indian Ocean. They arrived after 3 months at sea, and still in their desert-coloured uniforms. In that same convoy was a light tank squadron from India, the only tanks that Percival was to possess in the whole campaign. Better late than never, I suppose. These reinforcements were met by the sight of the retreating army crossing the causeway from the mainland. Mind you, that retreat nearly ended in disaster. Orders had been given to blow the causeway at midnight on the 30th of January. And despite the fact that many units were still on the mainland side of the causeway, a sapper sergeant who had his orders was still intending to blow the bridge sky high at the allotted time, trapping thousands of men on the other side. That was until an Australian officer, John Wyatt, drew his pistol and made him delay. In the early hours of the 31st of January 1942, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders were the final troops to cross. As they marched over to Singapore, they were led by their 2 remaining regimental pipers, playing Highland Laddie. And then, with the skirl of the pipes disappearing into the distance, the engineers finally blew a 70-foot section of the causeway. The Battle of Malaya was over, and the Battle of Singapore was about to begin. For that battle, Percival had a garrison of over 85,000 men on Singapore, consisting of 38 infantry battalions, 17 Indian, 13 British, 6 Australian and 2 Malay, supported by 3 machine gun battalions, 9 artillery regiments, 3 anti-tank regiments and 152 anti-aircraft guns. He had food supplies for 3 months and thousands of tons of ammunition. And he was protected by the natural moat, the Straits of Johor. Opposing him was a Japanese army of only 30,000. So how did Singapore fall just 2 weeks later? Well, firstly, 85,000 men sounds good, but 15,000 of them were non-combatants, such as medical staff, logistics and even pay clerks. That 85,000 figure also included several thousand wounded troops in medical centres. And don't forget, over 10,000 of his men were effectively raw recruits with little to no training. I mean, even the well-trained British 18th Brigade was still finding their legs after 3 months at sea. Nevertheless, despite that, as long as the Japanese didn't land in any numbers, all might be good. Percival judged that he would have a period of grace before the Japanese could assemble enough vessels to launch a serious landing on the island. But once more, he had underestimated the Japanese. In an extraordinary physical feat, they hauled their landing craft all the way from the beaches in the north, and within a week they would possess 150 craft ready for their assault. Now, while Singapore is a small island, at the time it was about 220 square miles, about 600 square kilometres, even with 85,000 men, that's actually a large perimeter to hold. I mean, where would the Japanese actually try to land? Percival decided that the obvious place was on the north-northeast of the island, around the causeway and the naval docks, and he moved the largest part of his force, comprising the Indian and British troops, to this sector. Wavell disagreed. He believed that the Japanese would attack on the northwest side of the island. He reasoned that they'd come down the western side of Malaya and so would stay true to form and concentrate on the west, rather than suddenly moving eastwards. He also noted that the Strait of Johor was narrower at the northwest of the island. You will recall that Wavell had overridden Percival's troop disposition before the Battle of Johor. Well now, and maybe because that battle had gone so badly, Wavell at this crucial minute stood back and let Percival have his way. Percival now placed just 3 Australian battalions to protect the northwest shores. It would prove a major error of judgment, but one that Wavell had sanctioned, despite his own gut feelings. Because on the 8th of February, just a week after the retreat across the causeway, the Japanese opened a fierce bombardment on the Australian position at the northwest of the island. Throughout the day, more than 80,000 shells were fired across the narrow strait. It had all the hallmarks of a pre-attack. But even now, Percival persisted in his belief that the main attack would be further east. Maybe, he argued, this bombardment was just a decoy to weaken his defences around the causeway. But he was wrong. At 8:15 p.m, 168 Japanese guns all fired in unison, and then the Australian troops near the beaches heard the hum of motor engines approaching across the water. Half an hour later, the first Japanese troops landed on Singapore. That night, the Japanese landed 13,000 men and a further 10,000 just after dawn on the northwest coast. 16 battalions. Opposing them were 3 Australian battalions. And therein lies another reason for the ultimate Japanese success. Whilst they were outnumbered on the island, they chose to concentrate their attack in one place, overwhelming their enemy. And in fairness, Percival couldn't have 85,000 troops in one place when he didn't know where the Japanese would attack. His mistake, however, was not to rush troops from the north and northeast to shore up the battered Australians. In fact, the only reinforcements that the Australians received were 460 men from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, 200 Royal Marines, formerly from HMS Prince of Wales in the Repulse, and a 400-strong contingent from the Hyderabad Regiment of the Indian Army. By the afternoon of the 9th of February, the Japanese had penetrated about 6 miles inland and captured the main RAF base at Tenga. Having said that, they had long ago achieved air superiority, and a few days beforehand, what was left of the RAF had actually been pulled back to the Dutch island of Sumatra. The next day, the 10th of February, Wavell sent Percival a message from Prime Minister Winston Churchill. "The battle must be fought to the bitter end at all costs," said the Prime Minister. "Commanders and senior officers should die with their troops. The honour of the British Empire and the British Army is at stake." But by then, the Battle of Singapore was going from bad to worse. In the west, attempts to hold a defensive position, the Jurong Line, had collapsed, and by the 11th the Japanese had captured Bukit Timah. Standing at 500 feet or 160 metres above sea level, the hill is the highest point on the island, and in the nearby town that bears the same name, the Japanese captured Percival's main food and fuel depots. The following day, the order was given to fall back to defensive perimeter around Singapore city itself, and the Japanese now seized the island's reservoir. However, for some reason, they didn't actually turn off the water supply to the defenders. However, by the morning of the 13th, Chief Engineer Brigadier Simpson reported that half the city's water supplies were running through broken pipes. At that rate, Simpson calculated, the water would run out in about 48 hours. Through that day and into the next, the Japanese advance continued with a fury. When the Alexandra Military Hospital was captured, 250 medical staff and patients were bayoneted to death, including some who were on operating tables under anaesthetic. By now there were 1 million people, troops and civilians, in an ever-decreasing enclave in and around Singapore City, with dwindling food, fuel and ammunition supplies, and water on the verge of drying out. With no air support, they were subjected to constant air raids. At 8 a.m. on the 15th, Percival received a cable from Wavell, giving him discretion to cease fighting when all other options ran out. An hour later, he met his senior commanders. He offered them 2 options. He personally advocated a counterattack to recapture the reservoirs and supply dumps at Bikut Timah. Option 2 was to seek terms for a surrender. Not a single one of the 12 senior commanders spoke up for a counterattack. All voted to surrender or simply kept silent. Feeling that he had no other alternative, Percival sent an officer to seek terms, and at 5:15 p.m. on the 15th of February 1942, he formally surrendered to the Japanese. 85,000 men passed into captivity. It was the largest ever surrender in the history of the British Army. Those men joined those who had been captured during the Battle of Malaya. In total, over 130,000 men. 38,000 British, 15,000 Australians, 67,000 Indians, and 14,000 local Malayan Singapore volunteers. 8,000 men had been killed and wounded in the combined campaigns. It was not simply a massive military defeat, but a political one too. The prestige of the British Empire in the Far East and India would never recover from this reversal, at the hands of an Asian enemy. Many of those Indian POWs later joined the pro-Japanese Indian National Army, which would fight in Burma. Many of the other POWs would also end up in Burma, but as forced labour building the Burma Railway. Over 12,000 Allied prisoners of war and 90,000 civilians would die in what is often called the Death Railway. The Japanese occupation of Singapore would last until the end of the war. During that time, they would massacre between 40 and 50,000, mainly Chinese, civilians. The 15th of February, the day of Percival's surrender, is still observed in Singapore. It's now called Total Defence Day. So we come to the crucial question. Was General Percival really to blame for the fall of Singapore? Well, as the man on the ground, the spotlight certainly does focus on him. He made an error in believing that the Japanese wouldn't attack Singapore on the northwest coast, and that when they did, he still refused to send adequate reinforcements because he was firmly of the belief that it was merely a diversion. Throughout the campaign, his intelligence estimates concluded that the Japanese forces were far larger than they were, and this coloured his reaction at different times during the battles of both Singapore and Malaya. Importantly, he failed to allow Simpson to build defences both before the conflict had started and as his men retreated down the Malayan Peninsula. Partly this was because he believed that the best way to win campaigns was to go on the offensive. The only problem was he never did. Even when he believed a counterattack was possible, such as during the last days in Singapore, he failed to press his point with his subordinates. Nor did he push his superior, Brooke-Popham, to fully implement Operation Matador at the outset. Had he pushed for that action, rather than accepting his superior's hesitation and then half-cock Plan B, maybe he could have brought valuable time to fortify the Jitra line just inside Malaya. Maybe it was his polite staff officer approach that was his downfall. That lack of willingness to rock the boat meant that he didn't vigorously press for additional troops or tanks before the war. It also meant that he allowed General Wavell to interfere with his plans for the crucial battle in Johor. And General Wavell himself can't escape total blame. His personal bias against Percival's abilities and in favour of General Gordon Bennett led him to interfere in Percival's order of battle in Johor. But then, having shown his willingness to interfere, he crucially failed to intervene and order Percival to place more troops on the northwest of the island, despite his gut telling him that's exactly where the Japanese would strike. And whilst we're on the subject of superior officers, maybe the spotlight also needs to turn on Air Chief Marshal Robert Brooke-Popham. He'd been responsible for both the air and ground preparations of Malaya and Singapore for a year before hostilities broke out, and yet he'd failed to push for more planes or men with the government in London. And at the same time, his ignorance and prejudice against the Japanese blinkered his strategic response to the threat of a possible invasion, not least accepting the quality of his aircraft. And finally, when that conflict did arise, he refused to implement Operation Matador for fear of making the wrong diplomatic call. Napoleon once said, "I would rather have a general who is lucky than one who is good." And it can be argued that General Percival was really unlucky. After all, it was not Percival who had provided inadequate numbers of troops, planes or ships to protect Malaya or Singapore, nor to send thousands of raw troops to do that job. It wasn't Percival who diverted tanks to the Soviet Union rather than to the Fortress of the East. And it wasn't Percival who ordered just 2 ships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, to Singapore without an aircraft carrier. He was the man on the ground, trying to make the best of decisions that others, government and military high command back in London, had made over many years. The whole main fleet to Singapore strategy had never been pursued with any great commitment. If it had, the funds would have been made available to build an air presence capable of defending the island until that fleet arrived. And even the construction of the naval dockyard had been delayed and cut back by Chancellors of the Exchequer seeking to limit military spending. And incidentally, one of those Chancellors, the one from 1924 to 1929, was Winston Churchill. It was Churchill too who, as the Second World War progressed, had prioritised the best resources to the European and North African campaigns, Remember, even the 18th Brigade, whose futile arrival in Singapore just weeks before the surrender, had originally been bound for Egypt, not the Far East. And yet, it was Winston Churchill who called the fall of Singapore the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. And well, it might have been. But when you start to tie all these different strands together, the fall of Singapore was actually a lot more predictable than he and others chose to believe. General Dobbie had sounded the alarm bells back in 1937. Maybe Percival was totally out of his depth and should never have been appointed to this command. Or maybe he was on hiding to nothing, and even commanders like Montgomery or Patton or Rommel might have struggled with the hand that Percival was dealt. But at the end of the day, he was responsible for the defence of Malaya and Singapore, and it was Percival who surrendered it. General Yamashita believed the British general was timid and hesitant in making command decisions. And whilst we can argue about who was responsible for the British defeat, let us not forget that the Japanese played their part too. They advanced over 650 miles, 1,000 kilometres, in less than 2 months, and had done so by travelling through supposedly impenetrable jungles. And by using bicycles, they had travelled at speeds that constantly threatened to outflank their enemy. They were better prepared too, whether it was in their investment in tanks or air support, or simply transporting their landing craft down the whole Malay Peninsula. And despite being outnumbered, they focused their attacks on narrow fronts where they could overwhelm their opponents. At the end of the day, Yamashita said his soldiers won because they had more desire to win. And if it would seem that Percival was unlucky, then General Yamashita could be considered more than lucky. I mean, what military commander turns down 2 divisions for an invasion and still succeeds? But he did. By the time his exhausted but elated troops were on Singapore Island, they were actually running out of supplies. In fact, when the guns fell silent, his artillery only had enough ammunition, about 100 rounds per gun, to continue firing for another few hours. And yet, when Percival met Yamashita at the surrender negotiations, the Japanese general bluffed regarding both the size of his forces and his supplies. He banged the table and demanded an immediate surrender. And Percival fell for it. Earlier that morning, Percival had wanted to launch a counterattack to recapture the reservoir and his supply depots. And it's interesting to wonder, based on Yamashita's supply problems, what might have happened had he succeeded. But of course, that counterattack never happened, principally because he was voted down by his subordinates, such as Generals Heath and Australian Gordon Bennett. Considering what was in store for their men as POWs, you do have to wonder if a final bloody counterattack was any worse than what was to befall them. Controversially, after Percival had agreed to surrender, Gordon Bennett escaped the island, leaving his men to their fate. At least Percival went into captivity with his men. Initially he joined other POWs in Changi prison on the island, but in August 1942 he was moved to Formosa, or Taiwan, and then Manchuria. He was liberated by an OSS team near the end of the war, and was invited by General MacArthur to stand behind him on USS Missouri for the Japanese surrender on the 2nd of September 1945. Percival returned to England and retired from the army in 1946. He lived in his native county of Hertfordshire, where he died in 1966. During his retirement, Percival served as the president of the Far East Prisoners of War Association, and in that role he led protests against the way the film Bridge on the River Kwai depicted the British commanding officer on the Death Railway. Because Lieutenant Colonel Philip Toosey, who had been captured at the fall of Singapore, was nothing like the character portrayed by Alec Guinness in the film. Toosey was no misguided collaborator, but actually actively sought to undermine the construction project. And Percival successfully lobbied for a disclaimer to appear at the beginning of the film, stating that it was a work of fiction. Now, I'm going to let you decide how responsible Percival was for the fall of Singapore. But maybe the fall of Singapore is a lesson from history which we would do well to heed. Because as much as a general out of his depth, it's a story of a lack of investment, deluded self-confidence, and a refusal to acknowledge your enemies' or potential enemies' aims and abilities. And those factors as much as one general, possibly sealed Singapore's fate long before the Japanese ever arrived. You can watch the story about Lieutenant Colonel Tusi, the real hero at the bridge on the River Kwai, by clicking on the link now. And a massive thanks to all of my supporters, and you can find out how you can support my show in the description below. Thanks for joining me today for this slightly longer story to usual. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.